Chinese labor and mining right here at Folsom Lake in Granite Bay, California. Hi, I'm Kevin Canals, and I'm a local historian here in Granite Bay, and I do a lot of historical research on Folsom Lake and what it was like before the dam and the lake were put in the 1950s. And I came across some documents from the 1850s and 1860s down at the Huntington Library that really shed some light on who some of the miners were that worked in this area. And in particular, this area, which we called, this is Dike 5, and it was known as the Rose Springs District. Now, let's set up the context. In 1854, the American River Water and Mining Company initiated the organization of the North Fork Ditch. And the North Fork Ditch was a water canal that ran from Auburn all the way down to right about where Folsom Dam is today. Now, there was a branch off of the main canal called Rose Springs, the Rose Springs branch. And it is right underneath the water right out there because there was actually a spring of water there that just bubbled up continuously, and that was called Rose Springs. And so they cut a ditch from the main canal and went through what today is Dike 5 and to the west. And that serviced miners and later on farmers and ranchers south out towards what we now know as Folsom Lake Estates, in between Folsom Lake Estates and the Granite Bay Golf Course. But what was really fascinating was that within the Catlin papers at the Huntington Library were payment receipts for labor in 1863, along with the weekly water sales reports. And what is fascinating is that in 1863, the American River Water and Mining Company employed a lot of Chinese men to do work on repairing the North Fork Ditch and the Rose Springs Ditch. Now, in 1862, there were catastrophic floods. And those floods on the North Fork of the American River and down into Sacramento, but on the North Fork, it wiped out the dam of the North Fork Ditch and much of the infrastructure, the flumes, and then of course that exposed other parts of the ditch to be just filled up with, rocks, debris, and sludge. And we have to remember these water canals, they were all gravity flow. So you have a few implements, rocks in there and mud, this doesn't work. So in 1863, they needed to repair and clean out many of the branches and the main canal. And 1863, we had the railroad. The Central Pacific was building the railroad, Pacific Railroad, and so that was taking men away. And we also had the Civil War going on, but there were Chinese labor here in the area, and I was surprised to learn how much Chinese labor was actually used. What is interesting on the payment receipts is it lists the district in which the person was employed, and generally what the rate was per day and to whom it was being paid. Now, these payment receipts, the recipient was supposed to sign their name. Now, many Chinese people couldn't write English, some of them did, and they would actually put Chinese characters to affirm that they had received the payment for the work they had done. There were white miners that were also employed, and they didn't know how to sign their name, and some of them just have an X there, this is his mark. So, but that was all to keep track of that they were paying, that the American River Water and Mining Company was paying wages. And if you go through, which I have done, and look at the different payment receipts, you'll see the Rose Springs and the number of Chinese that worked on the reservoir. There was a little reservoir right in front of Dike 4 towards the western edge of Mooney Ridge, and that kind of pooled some water and allowed that to flow into the Rose Springs branch and out and towards Fox Ravine and Strap Ravine, and there was another ditch, the Allen Ditch, that it also supplied some water to. And so the Chinese laborers worked on rebuilding the reservoir, cleaning it out, digging new ditch in Fox Ravine, and they also did some work at other locations up at the dam at Tamaroo Bar and some other locations, and there were white individuals that were employed as well. But what is interesting in the description, there's enough of the payment receipts that have the daily rate. It is very obvious that a Chinese individual for 1 day's work was paid $1.50, while their white counterpart was paid $2.50. And I've gone through and I've looked at it all and I've calculated it all out, and it is consistent. Now, some of the white miners, they had some skills for repairing bridges that you would, necessarily expect might yield a higher per day rate. But there was just many white miners that was digging ditches, doing the same exact labor as the Chinese. And so, that was just a function of the time. And the Chinese worked on many of the different canals to get them back in shape. The American River Water and Mining Company was under a lot of stress. They had to rebuild much of the canal, they had to take out more loans, and mining was decreasing, and the whole foundation of the North Fork Ditch was selling water to miners. So that was the next batch of information at the Huntington Library. Rose Springs was quite a distance from the American River, and obviously a higher elevation, and that's why the miners needed water. But what were they mining? You can see all of this river rock that has been deposited, lahar, and it is on top of granite. And so maybe an ancient river ran through here. On top of this particular ridge, there was a hole that went down to the granite, and there was an exit on the north side. So miners were going down there, kind of in a drift mine operation, scraping up whatever gold dust they could get on top of the bedrock, the granite, and then taking that and converting it into currency. But you can see all of the rock that needed to be washed, and so they would put it in wheelbarrows and just hand carts and get it down there, and they needed the water from the ditch to wash the placer gold dust from all of the rocks and the soil. The North Fork Ditch, American River Water and Mining Company, employed water agents, water collectors, to go into their district every week and collect the week's water rents. And they kept reports and submitted them, and the person that they sold the water to was listed. Now, the documents, they go back to about 1857, and they're kind of hit and miss, and they're not all there. But what is interesting is that there are several weeks for 1863 during the period when there were Chinese men working on repairing and cleaning out the North Fork Ditch and the Rose Springs Ditch. And so I'm looking at that, I'm saying, these are the same men, which meant that the men working for the American River and Water Mining Company on the North Fork Ditch were also miners and lived in the area. Names such as Ah Sing, Ah Fook, Ah Yang, Ah Goon, they pop up numerous times in the water payment receipts, and also buying water on the Rose Springs Ditch. And because there's a couple different ones listed on there, and of course they may be pulling some men from Folsom potentially. They would have little companies, so there would maybe only be one Chinese individual listed, and it'll say "and company," so his men. But you can see that if there were 5 men and they were paid for $1, it'd be 5 times $1.50. But it confirms that these Chinese miners that worked on the North Fork Ditch were residents of this area. Today we call it Granite Bay, and the area of the Rose Springs Ditch, goes through the to the west side of Folsom Lake Estates and over by the Granite Bay Country Club. Fox's Ravine is now Linda Creek, but Strap Ravine is still there, and some of the Chinese worked over there. Now, they would have worked in these different areas here and washing the dirt from the upslope portion, and they were scratching out, you were lucky if you could get $2 a day in gold dust. So being paid $1.50 wasn't too bad. Of course, we do have to remember that there was the foreign miners tax. So they had an additional burden on them that white miners didn't have. But it was so exciting to see these Chinese men who were employed on the North Fork Ditch and also buying water from the North Fork Ditch and residing in the area, which adds to the overall history and understanding of the Granite Bay area. And of course, the Native Americans were here long before the white men and the Chinese, but it's just another little part of history. So hopefully you enjoyed it. I'm Kevin Canals. Enjoy your history hikes.